Hello and welcome back. Today, we are tackling a famous one. I am honestly surprised we have not covered this case in this level of detail yet. It is, of course, the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. Now, this is a brutal case. And I want to be clear, it is not simple. It is complicated, it is incredibly long, and it is filled with shadows and contradictions. The script for this is massive, so we are going to be here for a little while. I am familiar with this. I think just about every British person, and frankly, most of the world, is familiar with this case on some level. But if you are not, you are about to be. And if you think you are, the details we are about to explore might surprise you. We are going to go through it all, from the beginning, moment by moment. If you appreciate that kind of deep dive and this type of detailed storytelling, please do me a small favor and hit that like button. It really does help. And if you have not already, please consider subscribing to the channel so you do not miss what comes next. Alright, let's just dive in, shall we? It was mid-afternoon on April the 28th, 2007. The name itself was a promise, whispered in the damp grey offices of Northern Europe. Praia da Luz, the beach of light. It sounded like a sanctuary, a place of warmth and, above all, safety. It was a name passed between weary middle-class families as a guarantee of escape. It had not always been this way. The place had once been an impoverished fishing village, its fortunes governed by the harsh tides. But beginning in the 1960s, a transformation had occurred. The old village was buried under a new identity, a bustling seaside resort engineered for a specific purpose. It was built for them, the British, the German, the Dutch. It was particularly attractive to families, offering a potent combination of a warm climate, fair prices, and extensive child care services. The illusion of a safe, sleepy coastal village was its primary commodity. The perception was that this was a place where one could be free from the worries of home. The town's population told the story. Almost half of the 3,500 permanent residents were not Portuguese. They were expatriates, either retirees warming old bones or younger, aspirational people who wanted to boast of owning a villa in the Algarve. It was an international hub where people of all walks of life came and went, their arrivals and departures barely noticed. But the perception was a lie, a dangerous, comforting mirage. The resort, like any place that attracts waves of transient visitors, inevitably attracted a darker element. Petty thieves, drug addicts, and conmen were the least of it. The reality, hidden from the holiday brochures, was that the region had a homicide rate twice Portugal's national average. This idyllic coast was a gateway. It was just a short hop and a skip away from Morocco, making it an ideal landing region for traffickers of guns, drugs, and people, all passing on their way into Europe. It was said that 70% of cannabis smuggled into the continent passed through the Algarve. Numerous gangs, British, Moroccan, Balkan, had a presence in the region. There was another, more specific shadow. The Portuguese police were aware of it. Since 2004, they knew a predator was operating within a 50-mile radius of Praia da Luz. He targeted British tourists. He broke into their holiday apartments at night. He targeted their young daughters. He spoke to them in heavily accented English, and the young victims all remarked on one chilling detail. He exuded a foul stench. He was out there, and he had already struck twice in Praia da Luz itself. The British consulate in the Algarve was aware of the threat. No travel warning was issued. The McCann family was not aware of any of this when they arrived on April the 28th, 2007. They were an upper-middle-class family of 5. Gerry McCann, originally from Glasgow, was a cardiac specialist. Kate McCann, from the suburbs of Liverpool, was a general practitioner. They lived a comfortable, newly refurbished life in a Leicestershire village. They were both devout Roman Catholics, regular churchgoers who had initially dreamed of having a family of 6 or 7 children. That dream had been a struggle. Kate, already in her mid-30s, had struggled to get pregnant. Through the help of IVF, they managed to have their first daughter, Madeleine, on May the 12th, 2003. She was cherished. Then, through IVF again, Kate gave birth to twins, Sean and Amelie, on February 1st, 2005. On that afternoon in late April, Madeleine was a very young child, just shy of her birthday. The twins were toddlers. They dropped off their luggage at the Ocean Club, a resort owned by Mark Warner Limited. They joined their party of friends, arriving in a sun-soaked paradise, oblivious to the fact that they were stepping into a place that was anything but the beach of light. The holiday party was a tight-knit group. They would later be known as the Tapas 9. 9 adults, 6 of whom were doctors, who had come to the Ocean Club to relax together. Between the 4 couples in the party, they had 8 small children. The McCanns, Kate, Gerry, young Madeleine, and the toddler twins, Sean and Amelie, were just one part of this collective. The Ocean Club resort was a mixture of cozy villas and low-rise apartments. Its grounds were designed with a specific philosophy, an open layout. It was built for convenience, not containment. People could pass from one end of the complex to the other without drawing much attention, moving freely between the pools and the residences. The McCann family was assigned apartment 5A. This apartment was not a protected villa in the heart of the complex. It was on the ground floor, situated at the very edge of the resort. Its location was a vulnerability, adjoining 2 separate public roads. Apartment 5A could be accessed in one of 2 ways. The first was the main entrance. This led to the apartment building's shared hallway, next to the parking lot and the Rua do Tor de Silva. This path took a resident to the apartment's front door. The McCanns, naturally, typically kept this front door locked. It was the conventional, secure way to enter a home. The second way was different. It was a path of casual convenience that would prove to be a fatal flaw. On the side of the building, opening directly onto the public road of Rua do Tor Francisco Gentle Martins, there was a small iron gate. This gate was not for security. It led to a pathway that ran behind the entire building. Immediately on the right of this path was the patio for apartment 5A. From the patio, the apartment could be accessed via sliding doors. The McCanns, like many holidaymakers seeking easy access to the sun, typically left these sliding doors unlocked. This meant that anyone, any resident, any tourist, any stranger could wander off the public street, push open the unsecured iron gate, and access the McCann's apartment in just a few paces. It was not a secure area. It was an open room, exposed to the world. The first 5 days of the holiday followed a similar pattern, a rhythm of separation and reunion. Each morning, the children were dropped off at the daycare service, the creche, provided by the Ocean Club. This allowed the adults their time. Gerry and Kate embraced it. They relaxed in the sun, attended tennis lessons, and went for long, arduous runs. They would collect the children at lunchtime, a brief period of family unity, before the youngsters were put back into daycare. This left the rest of the afternoon to themselves. At 5 or 6 in the evening, the children were retrieved for the day. They were taken back to apartment 5A for a precise and habitual 7 o'clock bedtime. The routine was comforting in its predictability, a little bit of play, getting into their pajamas, drinking a glass of milk, and falling asleep to bedtime stories. Then, the parents' evening would begin. While the children slept, Kate and Gerry would get ready to go out. This ritual was usually stretched out over 90 minutes. They would talk and enjoy a glass of wine in the room, transitioning from their role as parents to adults on holiday. A few minutes past 8:30, they would head down to the tapas restaurant. The restaurant was located about 60 yards, or 55 meters, away from their apartment, just on the other side of the swimming pool. Rachel Oldfield, one of their party, had reserved a table for the entire group of 9 adults at 8:30 every day for the rest of the week. A note about this reservation was left on the front desk by the hostess. It included an explanation to her manager. The parents wanted this specific table to be close to their children, who were sleeping alone in their apartments. For days, this note was visible to anyone who might be passing through the pool area. The arrangement was a conscious, deliberate choice. The Ocean Club provided a night creche service, an option specifically for guests who wanted to go out in the evenings without leaving their children. It was a well-run service. The kids would be entertained with games and movies, When they grew sleepy, they were put into comfortable beds in a private area until their parents returned. Many parents at the Ocean Club availed themselves of this service. The McCann party did not. Kate felt that the night creche would interfere with the children's habitual 7 o'clock bedtime. She also thought that once the children fell asleep in the quiet area, they would be constantly woken up by other adults, picking up their own children as the evening went on. The other parents in their group agreed. Instead, they devised their own system. They decided to leave their 8 small children asleep in their separate unlocked apartments. While their friends David and Fiona Payne had a baby monitor, the rest of the group, including the McCanns, relied on a different method. They would leave the dinner table at regular intervals to physically check on their kids. The 6 parents claimed they would each get up and check on their own children every 20 to 30 minutes. The checks were staggered, so only 1 or 2 people were away from the table at any given time. This, they said, was their routine, repeated for hours, until about 11 o'clock or midnight. It seemed like a good system, a fair system. It should be noted, however, that the staff of the tapas restaurant did not notice this constant flurry of comings and goings over the course of multiple evenings. The only verification that these checks were as diligent and punctual as they claimed rested solely on the word of the McCann party itself. The morning of May the 3rd arrived. It was just 9 days shy of Madeleine McCann's birthday. As the family sat at breakfast, the little girl piped up. She looked directly at her mother and asked a question that, in retrospect, was a chilling, unanswered alarm. "Why didn't you come?" Madeleine asked, "when Sean and I cried last night." Kate McCann was taken aback. She asked her daughter when she and Sean had been crying, and why. But the moment passed. A young child's attention is fleeting. Madeleine was distracted by something else, and the conversation shifted. Kate later dismissed the incident, thinking it improbable. Her children, she insisted, rarely stirred at all in the night, and certainly never before the early hours of the morning. The question was left hanging in the air, a signal completely missed. It was not the only strange detail. At that same breakfast, Kate noticed an unexplained brown stain on Madeleine's nightshirt. Later, a different kind of warning. A witness, who lived in the apartment directly above 5A, claimed that during the afternoon she saw a man. He came from the direction of the McCann's apartment. He did not just walk away. He slipped out via the iron gate onto the public road, taking specific care to close it quietly behind him. That afternoon, Madeleine spent time in the swimming pool with her family. It was here that the last known photograph of her was taken. When the McCanns collected their children from the daycare at around 5:30 in the evening, Madeleine seemed different. She looked pale and was so tired that she asked her mother to carry her all the way back to apartment 5A. Just before 6 o'clock, Gerry left to play tennis with David Payne, Matt Oldfield, and Russ O'Brien. Kate remained in the apartment, alone with the 3 children. She gave them milk, a biscuit, and some crisps. At around 6:40, David Payne, on his way back from the tennis court, popped his head in the patio door. He asked if the children would like to go down to the play area. Kate replied that they were too tired and were going to bed soon. According to Kate, she then sat on the couch with her children, with Madeleine dozing in her lap while Kate read them a story. Just before 7 o'clock, Gerry returned from tennis. The couple put their children to bed. Kate read them one last story. Madeleine, pale and exhausted, fell asleep before the story's conclusion. Gerry and Kate gave their children goodnight kisses. All, so far, was normal. The routine was holding. Between 7:15 and 7:30, Gerry took a shower while Kate did her hair and makeup. Then, for the next hour, from 7:30 to 8:30, the parents had a glass of wine in their room. They talked. They prepared for their evening. A few minutes past 8:30, they checked on the children one last time. All 3 were asleep. They then headed to the tapas restaurant. The McCanns arrived at the tapas restaurant a few minutes past 8:30 in the evening. They were the first couple to arrive, and over the next 10 minutes, they were gradually joined by the 7 others. The system of checks, the routine that had replaced the night creche, began. According to testimony, Matt Oldfield got up to do the first check on the children at around 8:55, less than 15 minutes after his arrival. On his way back, he stopped outside apartment 5A and listened at the window. All was quiet. At 9:05 in the evening, Gerry McCann got up from the table. He returned to apartment 5A. He looked into the children's bedroom and found all three of them asleep. He would later recall having a proud father moment as he looked at them. Then, Gerry McCann returned to the restaurant. As he was returning, he stopped to talk with another tourist on the Rua Douter Francisco Gentle Martins, just outside the Iron Gate. He was passed by Jane Tanner, who had left the table around 9 to 10 or 9:15 to check on her own daughter. Jane Tanner saw Gerry on the street. A little further on, she saw something else, something that would become a focal point of the early investigation. She saw a man carrying an unconscious girl, about Madeleine's size, across the junction. The man carried the girl horizontally in his arms, rather than with her head resting on his shoulder, a detail that struck Tanner as odd. This sighting, however, was not the only one. At around 10 o'clock, though the exact time remains highly uncertain, an Irish tourist named Martin Smith, along with his wife Mary, saw a different man. They were about 500 yards, or 460 meters, from apartment 5A. This man was also carrying a young girl, one who fit Madeleine's description. He was walking down the street, toward the beach. Smith would later describe the man as not looking like a tourist and looking uncomfortable carrying the child. Also at around 10 o'clock, a half hour after Matt Oldfield had checked on apartment 5A, Kate McCann got up from the table. She said she entered the apartment, as usual, through the unlocked patio doors. Immediately, she noticed that the door to the children's bedroom was wide open. As she approached it, the door slammed shut, as if blown by a powerful draft. Kate McCann opened the door again. She looked into the room. She saw that the bedroom window was wide open. The curtains were parted. The metal shutters, which they always kept down, were raised. Sean and Amelie were still asleep in their cots in the middle of the room, but Madeleine's bed was empty. The sheets had been thrown back. A stuffed animal, cuddle cat, rested on the pillow, left behind. Kate McCann said she initially thought, in a flash of desperate, reasonable hope, that Madeleine had woken up and gone into her and Gerry's bed. She checked. The master bed was empty. She returned to the children's room, frantically searching, looking under the bed, though the mattress was only an inch or two above the floor. She quickly searched the rest of the apartment. Madeleine was not there. The realization was absolute. Kate ran. She ran from the apartment, back across the pool area, back to the light of the restaurant. She was reportedly shouting, her voice cutting through the night. Madeleine's gone. Gerry's initial reaction was disbelief. She can't be gone. But Kate's cries evolved, her mind processing the open window, the raised shutter, the empty bed. The cries became a certainty, an accusation. They've taken her. The words were repeated, interspersed with sobs and howls of anguish. They've taken her. While Kate McCann seemed to immediately jump to the conclusion that Madeleine had been abducted, her friends clung to a different idea. It was the hope that Madeleine had merely woken up and wandered off. Perhaps she had gone out through the unlocked patio doors, or even the open bedroom window. It was the more likely scenario, the less terrifying one. The group, the Paynes, the Oldfields, and Russ O'Brien split up. They began a frantic, disorganized search of the resort complex and the surrounding neighborhood. Meanwhile, Gerry and Kate McCann had returned to apartment 5A. Kate was screaming, kicking, and punching the walls, repeating, "I've let her down. We've let her down." The noise was enough to attract the attention of the upstairs neighbor, who called over the balcony to ask what was happening. Gerry shouted back that their daughter had been abducted. When Russ O'Brien returned to the apartment after his brief search, he found Kate in hysterics and Gerry McCann lying on the floor, crying like a baby. It was only then, after Gerry collected himself for long enough, that he told Matt Oldfield to go to the front desk and get them to phone the police. The call went through at 10:41 in the evening. It had been roughly 40 minutes since Kate McCann first discovered her daughter was missing. The Portuguese authorities would later find it odd that the parents spent the first 40 minutes after their daughter's disappearance crying in the apartment and not racing around actively looking for their child. Shortly after calling the police, the Ocean Club initiated its missing child protocol. The staff fanned out across the property, joined by concerned locals and tourists, eventually amounting to a search party of about 60 people. The first police officers arrived. They were from the Guardia Nacional Republicana, or GIN. They were met at reception by senior hotel staff, Matt Oldfield, and Gerry McCann, who had come down from the apartment. Officer Nelson Coster testified that at this point, Gerry McCann knelt down and slammed his 2 hands on the floor, screaming twice in indescribable anguish. The 2 police officers headed to apartment 5A. As per protocol, they searched the residence to confirm that Madeleine was no longer there. They immediately realized the scene was compromised. So many people had moved in and out of the apartment in the hour since Madeleine's disappearance that it was impossible to preserve any evidence. Officer Jose Roge also noted in his report how it was odd that amid all the hubbub with 20 people coming and going, with the parents screaming and crying, and with Kate McCann previously punching and kicking the walls, the toddler twins, Sean and Amelie, were still fast asleep. Indeed, they would not wake up for the rest of the night. This detail, the impossible stillness of the twins amid the chaos, was noted. At 12:10 in the morning, the NER officers decided to contact the Policia Judiciaria, or PJ, who handled more serious crimes. The head of the local PJ unit, Gonzalo Amaral, was 20 miles away in Portimao. He was informed of the disappearance as he ate a late-night dinner. He dispatched 2 investigators to the Ocean Club. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, the PJ investigators arrived. They despaired at the lack of preservation of the scene. The investigation had begun in chaos. The following morning, May the 4th, 2007, the search resumed with the benefit of daylight. The frantic, disorganized night search gave way to a more structured, though equally desperate, effort. Hotel staff printed missing posters with Madeleine McCann's picture and began distributing them all over Praia da Luz. The first news stories of Madeleine's disappearance hit the airwaves at 7:30 in the morning on both British and Portuguese television. At the time, only a handful of reporters had arrived to cover the story, a few Portuguese, 1 British newspaper journalist, and 1 correspondent for the BCC. They did not expect the disappearance to escalate into a major story. They assumed, with reasonable hope, that the little girl would be found in a few hours, having simply wandered off. This assumption was wrong. When Gerry and Kate McCann returned to the resort after giving their first official statements, they found the number of journalists outside the Ocean Club had grown. The story, a young British girl, the daughter of 2 respectable doctors, snatched from her bed while on holiday, had begun to resonate. The McCanns sought refuge from the growing press corps, but Gerry decided to go out and talk to them. He and Kate walked out of the apartment. Kate clutched Madeleine's cuddle cat in her hands. Gerry's demeanor was fairly stoic, his voice clear and articulate as he looked directly at the journalists assembled. "Words cannot describe the anguish and despair that we're feeling as the parents of our beautiful daughter," he said. "Please, if you have Madeleine, let her come home to her mommy, daddy, brother, and sister." That first press conference was the spark. It intensified public and media interest beyond anything the Portuguese police had anticipated. A handsome, well-to-do couple, in pieces because they had lost their daughter. When a child goes missing, the attention is usually sparse and transient, confined to local media. But every so often, perhaps 1 in 1,000 times, the public and the media seize on a particular case. This was one of those cases. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann swiftly attained an immense international attention, the likes of which had never been seen. Within days, Madeleine's picture was printed in newspapers on literally every continent. The Portuguese police were appalled at how quickly the story gained traction. They believed the flood of journalists, onlookers, and bogus tips would hamper their investigation. There was also a more grim consideration. If Madeleine had been abducted by human traffickers, she had suddenly become the most recognizable girl on the planet. While this increased the chance of her being spotted, it might also prompt her abductors to harm her and dispose of her body, rather than risk trying to transport or sell her. From their first phone calls to the UK media on the night of the disappearance, the McCanns fell firmly behind the idea that publicity increased the likelihood that Madeleine would be found. But it was a very real possibility that as public attention reached a fever pitch, it may have hastened her death. While the McCanns waited in the parking lot for the Policia Judiciaria to arrive, a man named Robert Murat approached Kate McCann and Russ O'Brien. He was half British, half Portuguese. He lived with his mother in a house just 150 yards down the street from apartment 5A. He spoke both languages fluently. He volunteered to act as a translator between them and the police. Russ O'Brien put Murat's number into his phone. Robert Murat gradually introduced himself to the police, the hotel staff, and the arriving journalists, making similar offers of help. He placed himself, seemingly out of kindness, directly at the center of the flow of information. The days following the disappearance bled into a week. The Portuguese police expanded their search area from 29 square miles to 96. The effort was massive, involving around 80 officers who were joined by whatever volunteers they could find. They combed the town and the surrounding countryside, looking for any sign of Madeleine McCann or her remains. The fire service scoured the dense, dry scrubland. Divers descended into the coastal waters and examined the murky depths of the Bora Dam, 9 miles north of Praia da Luz. More than 400 houses and apartments were searched. The police conducted random stops around the town, hoping to create uncertainty for anyone who might be trying to transport the child. 700 people were questioned. The full fury of this ground search continued for a week, and then it tapered off. It had yielded nothing. Forensic technicians, meanwhile, scrutinized the contaminated ground zero of apartment 5A. The results were a void. They retrieved one usable fingerprint from the patio doors and a single palm print from the window in the children's room. Neither belonged to an intruder. The print on the patio door belonged to one of the near first responders. The palm print on the window, tilted at an angle, belonged to Kate. 146 hair samples were collected. 129 belonged to the McCanns, their party, or the resort staff. 17 belonged to an unidentified person. This could have been the abductor, or a random volunteer from the chaos of that first night, or simply a previous tenant. The lack of evidence was, in itself, a chilling revelation. It suggested the person who entered that room was not an amateur. They had likely worn gloves. With no physical trail, the police turned to the days leading up to the disappearance, and suspicious patterns began to emerge. Reports surfaced of con artists operating in the area, posing as charity workers. On April 20th, a British woman had been approached by a man collecting money for a children's orphanage in a nearby village, an orphanage that did not exist. Then, on April 28th, a British tourist staying in apartment 5A, the very apartment the McCanns would later occupy, was visited by a man who also claimed to be collecting for an orphanage. And on the afternoon of May 3rd, the day of Madeleine's disappearance, a British couple was approached by 2 men, again collecting money, this time for a hostel to keep young girls away from prostitution. The con always seemed to involve children. There was another, darker possibility, one the police already knew well, the smelly predator. The man who had been breaking into British holiday homes between 2004 and 2006, climbing into bed with young girls. A suspect had been questioned, a former Ocean Club employee named Eugenio Montero, who had been fired for theft. His mobile phone had been used near the resort on the night of Madeleine's disappearance. But Montero had died in a tractor accident in 2009, and the nighttime assaults had continued for a year after his death. The description of the attacker remained the same. The man who died was not the one they were looking for. The real predator was still out there. A third theory pointed toward careful, deliberate planning. A young girl named Tamsin Silence came forward. She stated that on April 30th, she had seen a man looking intently at apartment 5A from across the street. She saw the same man again at midday on May 2nd, the day before Madeleine vanished. This time, the man was standing in the pool area, once again, just staring at apartment 5A. Tamsin's description, light-skinned, fair-haired, about 30 to 40 years old, matched the description given by the McCann's upstairs neighbor. The one who saw a man slip out of the back of the apartment building and furtively close the iron gate on the day of the disappearance. Tamsin remembered the man was ugly and disgusting, with small pimples on his face. These sightings pointed strongly toward an abductor who had not acted on impulse, but who had scouted the apartment, learned the routine, and waited for the perfect moment to strike. The police were left with nothing solid. Just ghosts, strange sightings, and competing, unsubstantiated theories. They were grasping at straws. The investigation, having found no physical trace of Madeleine and no clear path forward, had begun to turn inward. It had stalled, and into this vacuum stepped Robert Murat. He had been there from almost the beginning, the half-British, half-Portuguese translator who lived just a short walk from apartment 5A. He had volunteered his services to the McCanns and to the Policia Judiciaria, placing himself at the very center of the crisis. He lingered outside the Ocean Club, talking to officers, consoling staff, and, most notably, approaching British journalists as soon as they arrived. He gave his opinion freely to a reporter from the Daily Telegraph, stating that Madeleine had been taken by someone from outside the area, was no longer in Portugal, and may never be found. It was this proximity, this eagerness, that first sowed the seeds of doubt. The journalist grew suspicious. As one reporter from the Sunday Mirror put it, he was just too close to the investigation. He spent too much time talking to the media and asked too many questions about the details of the disappearance. In the back of their minds was the dark memory of the Soham murders in 2002. The school caretaker, Ian Huntley, had been one of the last witnesses to see the girls alive. He had dived into volunteering, talking eagerly to the media, and he, too, had asked too many questions. He had turned out to be the killer. Now, here was Robert Murat, selflessly volunteering in a disturbingly similar way. A journalist named Laurie Campbell contacted the Policia Judiciaria, telling them her misgivings about Murat. Other journalists and anonymous tipsters followed, making a string of unsubstantiated allegations. It did not help that Murat had a slightly odd manner. He was described as highly repressed, guarded, and emotionless. He was tall, with what one commenter described as a Frankenstein-like face. He was blind in one eye, which a journalist harshly described as lifeless and wonky. This, combined with the facts of his life, a 33-year-old man, separated from a daughter around the same age, living with his mother, began to form a sinister narrative in people's minds. It was all petty and specious, but the case was stalled, and the police were beginning to grasp at straws. Then, the suspicion was given a name. On May the 13th, Jane Tanner, a member of the McCann's party, formally identified Robert Murat as the man she had seen carrying an unconscious young girl down the street, away from apartment 5A, on the night of the disappearance. The street he was walking down, she noted, led directly to his house. This changed everything. Chief Investigator Gonzalo Amaral ordered round-the-clock surveillance on Robert Murat. His phones were tapped. A thermal camera was used on his home. At 7 o'clock in the morning on May the 14th, Robert Murat got a phone call from the Policia Judiciaria. They said they had a breakthrough in the case and needed him to come in and translate some documents. As Murat exited the gate of his house, the PJ raided the place. They tossed the house and began preliminary excavations in the yard. Murat, meanwhile, was carted down to the police station in Portimao. He was questioned for approximately 19 hours. He later claimed he was given neither food nor water as the police leaned on him, hard, hoping to extract a confession. He was released in the early hours of May the 15th. He had not been charged, but he was declared arguido by the police. He was now, formally, a suspect. The media, which had first harbored the suspicion, now descended like locusts. Robert Murat's photograph was transmitted all over the world. Newspapers began running a series of scurrilous and unfounded articles, implying or outright stating that he was a predator, a trafficker, a monster. His life was dismantled in public. The suspicion spread, engulfing those around him. His girlfriend, Michaela Walksuch, was dragged in for questioning. His web designer, a Russian expert named Sergei Minka, was also targeted. Phone records indicated that at 11:30 on the night of Madeleine's disappearance, Murat had made a phone call to Minka. Minka had not answered, and Murat had no recollection of making it, speculating it must have been a pocket dial. It was enough. Police bundled Sergei Minka into the back of a car. When a search warrant came through, they raided his apartment, confiscating computers. Minka was taken to Portimao and interrogated for hours. Near the end, Gonzalo Amaral came into the room, kicked Minka's chair across the floor, and demanded to know why Murat had called him. Minka, who had not answered the call, could provide no information. Robert Murat remained in Arguido for over a year. He would later sue 11 British newspapers and Sky News, winning a series of public apologies and over £600,000 in damages. But in the spring of 2007, he was the face of the investigation, the convenient villain it had been desperate to find. For weeks, the investigation and the world's media had been consumed by the hunt for an external suspect. They had chased the phantom of Robert Murat, the specter of the ugly man with pimples, and the rumors of charity con artists. But the investigation into Murat was a dead end, and the other leads were just shadows. With the trail of the stranger gone cold, the Portuguese authorities were forced to turn their gaze inward. They had to consider the unthinkable. In the cold, hard world of criminal statistics, stranger abduction is an extreme rarity. It accounts for only about 1 to 5% of child abductions. The vast, unfortunate majority of cases are perpetrated by parents, relatives, or individuals otherwise close to the child. It was inevitable, then, that police scrutiny would eventually have to fall upon Kate and Gerry McCann, if only to definitively rule them out. What had been a quiet, internal police procedure soon exploded into the public domain. On June the 30th, the Portuguese newspaper Sol published a bombshell 3,000-word article titled The Pact of Silence. Its author, Felicia Cabrita, was a famous investigative journalist, renowned throughout Portugal. Cabrita, skeptical of the official story, had gone to the tapas restaurant. She had sat at the very same table the McCann party had used during their stay. Gerry had, several times, described the proximity of the restaurant to the apartment, stating it was not dissimilar to having dinner in your garden, and that there was a line of sight. Cabrita was astonished to discover that this was not true. From the table, you could barely make out the apartment at all. A wall and a high hedge stood in the way, completely obscuring the doors and the pathway behind the building. It was impossible to see anyone coming or going. The article also dismantled the group's timeline. Cabrita interviewed a member of the restaurant staff who claimed to have seen only one person, Russ O'Brien, get up from the table all evening prior to Kate McCann's discovery. The constant, staggered flurry of checks, the article implied, was a chaotic and unreliable narrative. The article got its name from two statements given to the journalists. Russ O'Brien had cut off his interview, saying, "I have nothing further to tell you. I am not going to dishonor the promise I made with Kate and Gerry." And David Payne had reportedly said, "We have a pact. This is our matter only. It is nobody else's business." This idea of a pact, an alliance to protect their story, was now loose in the world. As this narrative of suspicion was taking root in Portugal, the McCanns were, ironically, launching their own massive international public relations campaign. They had started the Find Madeleine Fund, which had accrued £1.85 million within weeks from donors, including billionaires and celebrities. They hired PR supervisors and began a 13-day international tour. This tour, which the media began to call the Roadshow, was meant to keep Madeleine's face in the news. The highly devout McCanns met the Pope in Rome. They traveled to Madrid, to Germany, to the Netherlands, often provided with private jets. But the slick, stage-managed photo ops began to strike the wrong chord. A rumble of public unease began to grow. People were becoming increasingly uncomfortable with how the focus was often on Gerry and Kate, meeting dignitaries, and less on Madeleine and the investigation. The couple was also reluctant to cry in public, reportedly having been told to avoid public displays of grief. This lack of visible tears, compounded by television footage of them occasionally smiling at photo ops, was interpreted by some as coldness. Narratives began to be spun. The McCanns had fallen headfirst into international fame and were reveling in it. This growing, unspoken hostility finally broke the surface on June the 7th, while the McCanns were in Berlin. A radio journalist named Ben Muller asked the question that had been festering in the public consciousness, the one that had, until now, been unthinkable. "How do you deal with the fact," he asked, "that more and more people seem to be pointing a finger at you, saying that the way you behave is not the way people would normally behave if their child is abducted, and they seem to be implying that you might have something to do with it?" The McCanns looked visibly uncomfortable. It was the first time they had been directly asked such a thing by a reporter in public. After a pause, Kate replied that it was only a very small minority criticizing them. Gerry then added, "I never heard before that anyone considers us suspects in this. The Portuguese police certainly don't." But they were wrong. The Portuguese police were, at that very moment, beginning to suspect them, and they were about to bring in a new, silent team of witnesses that could not be fooled. The investigation was turning. The focus on external suspects had yielded nothing but frustration and ruined reputations. Now, Chief Investigator Gonçalo Amaral made a decision. He requested specialized assistance from his British counterparts. He asked them to send the dogs. On July the 31st, police dog handler Martin Grime arrived, and he did not come alone. He brought two of the most highly trained and respected specialists in their field, two Springer Spaniels named Eddie and Keela. These were not just tracking dogs. They were silent, biological witnesses. Eddie was the cadaver dog. He was a veteran, with 7 years of work on over 200 cases, including assignments with the Federal Bureau of Investigation in America. In all that time, Eddie had reportedly never given a false start. He was trained not just to find a body, but to detect the lingering, microscopic scent of human decomposition, even in places where a body had been kept for only a short time before being moved. Keela was the blood dog. Her specialty was detecting the scent of human blood and other bodily fluids. She was so precise, she had once accurately located traces of blood that were 36 years old, even after a thorough attempt had been made to clean them up. The McCann's public relations advisor later stated that the family did not regard the dog's arrival as negative. The more experts working on the case, they reasoned, the better. At 8 o'clock in the evening on July the 31st, the dogs were introduced, one at a time, to apartment 5A. Eddie went in first. He began to work. Inside the apartment, he barked an alert. He signaled that he had detected the scent of a cadaver. The scent was not in the children's room. It was next to one of the beds in Kate and Gerry's room. Then, Eddie gave another alert. He detected the same smell, the scent of death, behind one of the sofas in the apartment's lounge. Eddie was taken out. Keela, the blood dog, was brought in. She, too, alerted. She alerted to the exact same spot behind the sofa. This was significant. The alerts were not in Madeleine's bed, but in the living area. A new dark hypothesis began to form. What if something had happened before bedtime? What if Madeleine had crawled behind the sofa or had been concealed there? The next day, August 1st, Eddie and Keela were taken to the new villa where the McCann family was now staying. Inside the villa, Eddie alerted again. He was drawn to a cabinet which contained Madeleine's bedtime toy, Cuddle Cat. When the cabinet was opened, Eddie alerted specifically to the toy itself. This was the same Cuddle Cat that Kate had carried in her hands during her first anguished press appearances. It was the same toy she had been photographed clutching to her face. It was later revealed that, sometime before the dogs arrived, Kate had washed the toy. She had explained that it smelled of suntan lotion and had gotten dirty. But despite being washed, Eddie had still detected the scent of a cadaver on it. A dog is capable of smelling the slightest, most persistent trace. On August the 2nd, the dogs were taken to an empty room where various items belonging to the McCanns were laid out. Both Keela and Eddie alerted to some of Kate McCann's clothes. The final test came on August the 6th. The dogs were taken to a parking garage which contained 10 vehicles. These cars were used by the McCanns, their 7 friends, Robert Murat, and Sergei Minka. The dogs were again introduced separately. Eddie, the cadaver dog, moved along the line of cars. He stopped. He alerted to the driver's side of a silver Renault. Keela, the blood dog, was brought in. She alerted to the boot of the very same car. This silver Renault was the vehicle the McCanns had rented. They had rented it 25 days, 3 weeks after Madeleine had disappeared. The questions were horrifying. Why would dogs with unimpeachable track records alert to a car that was not even present at the time of the disappearance? 2 hypotheses emerged. The first, and most tenuous, was that the McCanns had somehow concealed the body for over 3 weeks, despite the thorough ground searches and the constant media scrutiny, and had then used the car to transport the remains. The second, and more straightforward hypothesis, was one of invisible transfer. It suggested that the McCanns had disposed of the body on the night of May. The third, the scent that Eddie and Keela were trained to find had transferred. It had clung to Kate's clothes. It had soaked into Cuddle Cat. And then, weeks later, these items were placed inside the rental car, contaminating it with a microscopic trace. It was a trace invisible to any human eye, but to the dogs, it was a scream. The alerts from the dogs had given the Policia Judiciaria a new, terrible hypothesis. The lingering scent of death and blood, found in the apartment and, crucially, in the car rented weeks later, pointed away from a stranger. It pointed directly at the parents. The working theory was now one of accidental death. An accidental overdose of sedatives, perhaps, followed by a panicked, desperate cover-up and a staging of an abduction. All that was missing was definitive, physical proof. The samples taken from behind the sofa and from the boot of the silver Renault were sent to a specialist forensic laboratory in the United Kingdom. The investigators waited. The results, when they came, were not the simple confirmation the police had hoped for. The report was complex. The samples were tiny. The traces of DNA minimal and in poor condition. They were thoroughly inconclusive. The sample from the boot of the car contained DNA from at least 3 contributors, all from the McCann family, but the lab could not determine if Madeleine was one of them. The sample from behind the sofa was also inconclusive, though it showed a closer match. It was not enough to charge anyone, and certainly not enough to secure a conviction. The police, however, now had the ambiguous report in their hands. They knew the DNA tests were not conclusive, but they also knew the McCanns did not. A new strategy was formed, a cynical and high-stakes gambit. Alleged police leaks began to pour into the press, to both Portuguese and British newspapers. The narrative these leaks told was very different from the official lab report. They claimed the DNA results were far more decisive, a match, possibly up to 80 or even 100%. This was a bluff, a psychological play designed to rattle the McCanns, to cause them to panic and confess. On September the 3rd, the McCanns were told to come to the police station in Portimao in 3 days' time and to bring their lawyer. On September the 6th, Kate McCann arrived. She was separated from Gerry and taken into an interrogation room. The interview lasted for 11 hours. The atmosphere, which she had previously found amicable, was gone. The investigators told her flatly that they did not believe her version of events. They suggested that her memory was at fault. Kate burst into tears, sobbing, but she stuck to her story. The real blow came after. Their own Portuguese lawyer reviewed the evidence the police claimed to have: the dog alerts, the supposed DNA match, the witness sightings. He then told them the police had offered Kate a plea deal. If she would confess to the accidental death and to concealing the body, she would likely get 2 years in prison. Gerry would walk free. But if Kate did not confess, they would both face life. According to the lawyer, Kate's reaction was violent and furious. Gerry, according to Kate, sank to his knees and began sobbing, repeating, "We're finished. Our life is over." Then, after a few minutes, he rallied and shouted at his lawyer, "They have nothing." The next day, September the 7th, Kate McCann returned for more questioning. This time, she was not asked to tell her story. Instead, she was read a list of 40 questions. What did they keep next to their bed, where the dog had smelled a cadaver? Why, from the very beginning, Had she insisted Madeleine had been abducted? Why did the twins sleep through the chaos? Was she accustomed to giving her children medication? As she sat there, Kate McCann declined to answer every single question. After the interrogation, she was taken outside, before the press, and a police spokesperson formally declared her an arguido, a formal suspect. That same day, Gerry showed up in a separate car for his turn. He was interviewed for 4 hours. Unlike Kate, he answered the questions put to him. He was asked whether he had taken part in Madeleine's disappearance. His answer was no. He was asked whether his wife had ever suffered from depression. No. Whether they had ever sedated their children. No. Then, Gerry was shown the video of the sniffer dogs alerting. He remarked that the alert behind the sofa could be explained by Madeleine having a nosebleed, but he could not remember her having one. Like Kate, Gerry was then taken outside before the mob of journalists, and a Policia Judiciaria spokesman declared him, too, an arguido. His expression was one of scorn and fury. The police had played their hand. They had declared the parents formal suspects in the disappearance of their own daughter. The next morning, September the 9th, the McCanns, against the advice of their public relations team who warned it would look like they were fleeing, got into their rental car. They drove to the airport. A fleet of journalists followed them. They boarded an EasyJet flight back to the United Kingdom, leaving Portugal and the investigation behind. The Policia Judiciaria's great gamble had failed. Their suspects were now in another country, protected by a wall of lawyers and British police bureaucracy. The Portuguese authorities had lost. With the McCanns' departure to the United Kingdom, the Portuguese investigation had lost its momentum and its primary targets. The gambit to force a confession had failed, and the case was left in bureaucratic limbo. On July the 21st, 2008, over 14 months after Madeleine's disappearance, the Portuguese authorities officially closed the case. The arguido status of Gerry and Kate McCann and of Robert Murat was formally dropped. The investigation was archived. The summary prepared for the Portuguese Attorney General, however, did not offer a clean slate. It concluded with a final, venomous observation, stating that the parents have already paid a heavy penalty due to their lack of carefulness in the watching and protection of their children. Just 3 days after the case was shelved, a new book hit the market in Portugal. It was written by Gonçalo Amaral, now an ex-cop with a bone to pick. His career had been torpedoed, and his book, titled Maddie, The Truth of the Lie, laid out his hypothesis for the world to see. Madeleine had died of an accidental overdose, and the parents had staged an abduction to cover up her death. The book was an immediate sensation in Portugal, selling 180,000 copies in just 3 months. The McCanns, of course, lawyered up, beginning one of the longest and most complex legal battles of the entire affair. They won an injunction, banning the book, which was then overturned. They sued for libel and won, only to have that ruling overturned as well. Years later, in February 2017, the Portuguese Supreme Court would rule in Amaral's favor, declaring that the archiving of the original case did not mean the McCanns had been cleared. But back in 2007, with the official police force no longer searching and their primary investigator now accusing them in print, the McCanns had to turn to a different, private world to continue the search. Their efforts were bankrolled by an unlikely figure, Brian Kennedy, a self-made millionaire from the double-glazed window industry. Kennedy had been outraged by the news coverage implicating the McCanns. He decided they were innocent, he later said, after listening to Kate talk for about 12 seconds. He became the principal pillar of support for the Find Madeleine Fund and their private investigative efforts for the next 4 years. First, Kennedy hired a Spanish detective firm called Método 3 at a cost of £50,000 a month. The firm deployed 35 agents across Europe and Morocco. But according to the investigator on the ground, only he investigated the disappearance full-time. The firm chased down thousands of sightings, including a strange tip from a witness in Barcelona who claimed to have encountered a well-dressed woman resembling Victoria Beckham, who had asked, "Have you come to deliver my daughter?" They also posed as predators on illicit message boards, trying to find information on the dark web. This resulted in no leads for Madeleine, but did, as a silver lining, lead to the arrest of several other child predators. The firm's work, however, was undone by its own director, Francisco Marco, who gave an interview claiming, "We are very, very close to finding the kidnapper." This was, apparently, a complete fabrication, done purely for self-promotion. Brian Kennedy fired Metodo 3. He then shifted his gaze to the impressive-looking firms in America. He wound up hiring Oakley International, which boasted agents who formerly worked for the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and MI5. The cost was staggering, £500,000, to hire the firm for 6 months, much of which had to be paid up front. It was a complete and total fraud. The president of Oakley International was a man named Kevin Hogan, who claimed to be a former United States intelligence operative. It turned out he was actually an Irish citizen masquerading as an American, and all of his intelligence credentials were fraudulent. While some of his contractors were legitimate ex-officers, Hogan was slow to pay them, and often never paid them at all. He was, it was alleged, embezzling most of the money. He sent invoices to Brian Kennedy, promising CIA satellite photos of Praia da Luz from the night of the disappearance. After months of waiting, Hogan simply turned in Google Earth images of the town. When Kennedy caught wind of the fact that tips from the hotline were being ignored, he tried to contact Hogan, who had become a difficult man to track down. Hogan, it was later alleged, resorted to blackmailing the McCanns, threatening to expose them for something, though it was not clear what. Shortly afterward, Hogan fled to Italy, having embezzled approximately £300,000 of the fund's money. He was later arrested by the Federal Bureau of Investigation for fraud against a different client, tried, and convicted. He died in 2018. The McCanns, having been failed by the official police, were now being actively cheated by the private detectives they had paid to find their daughter. The trail had gone cold, polluted by incompetence and greed. The Portuguese police had officially archived the case, their lead investigator now reduced to selling his accusations in a best-selling book. The private sector had proven even worse, a realm of fraudsters and con artists who had embezzled the McCann's search fund while delivering nothing but false hope and Google Earth images. Failed by the Portuguese system and cheated by private enterprise, the McCanns realized they needed a different kind of power. They turned their focus to their own government. In March 2010, Gerry and Kate McCann secured a meeting with Jim Gamble, the chief of the British Child Exploitation and Online Protection Command. Gamble, who had once admitted his own personal suspicions about Gerry, now put those feelings aside. He saw 2 parents let down by the system. He suggested they write him a formal letter, one requesting a full review of the case. This letter, he explained, he could then forward to the British Home Office to start the official process. The political timing was complicated. The Labour government, which had been sympathetic, was thrown out of office in the 2010 general election. The McCanns now had to appeal to a new Conservative leadership. They met with the new Home Secretary, Theresa May. The McCanns left nothing to chance. This was a full-scale political campaign. Kate's book, Madeleine, Our Daughter's Disappearance and the Continuing Search for Her, was released in May 2011. It was far more than a memoir. It was a powerful tool of political leverage. The book closed by explicitly asking every reader to write directly to Prime Minister David Cameron and to Home Secretary Theresa May, demanding a new, official investigation. They followed this maneuver with an open letter to the Prime Minister, published in the Sun newspaper on May the 12th, what would have been Madeleine's birthday. The strategy worked. The pressure, both public and private, became undeniable. On the evening of Madeleine's birthday, the Prime Minister replied in a private letter to the McCanns, promising help. Shortly after, Theresa May announced in public that she was setting up a new inquiry. This would not be a simple review. It would be a full-scale investigation, headed by Scotland Yard. It was given a name, Operation Grange. This was the investigation the McCanns had been fighting for. It began with 29 detectives and 8 support staff, led by Detective Chief Inspector Andy Redwood, a specialist in cold cases. The initial budget was £3.5 million. The Portuguese authorities, observing this massive undertaking, responded by quietly reopening their own investigation, but it was clear that Scotland Yard was now in control. Detective Chief Inspector Redwood made the new focus clear. Operation Grange was looking at the disappearance as a criminal act by a stranger. This was either a targeted abduction or a robbery gone wrong. The parents' theory, which had consumed and ultimately destroyed the Portuguese investigation, was officially off the table. Operation Grange was exhaustive. It was a methodical sweep of every piece of data from the previous 4 years. They investigated the known suspects linked to the spate of burglaries in Praia da Luz during that period. None, however, could be conclusively connected to Madeleine's disappearance. Years later, a senior Scotland Yard official would state that the robbery gone wrong theory, while still plausible, was highly unlikely. Nothing, after all, had been stolen, except Madeleine. They attached a great amount of weight to the reports of the ugly man with pimples, the one seen by the young witness, Tamsin Silence, and the upstairs neighbor, staring at apartment 5A. In 2013, a major public awareness campaign was launched, including new efforts to track down this mysterious, fair-haired man. The campaign failed. They investigated mobile phone tracking, ruling out several individuals, including Ocean Club employees. They investigated tenuous links to other known offenders. In 2016, they even briefly looked into the deceased British broadcaster Clement Freud, who had lived in Praia da Luz and had interacted with the McCanns. But, like every other lead, it led nowhere. The years ticked by. By October 2015, Operation Grange had chased up 8,000 tips, conducted 1,338 interviews, and investigated 60 suspects. The cost had spiraled to approximately £11.5 million. The result was the same as all the investigations that had come before: 0 decisive leads. The investigation was scaled back to just 4 investigators, with its funding renewed in small 6-month increments. By 2019, the British government announced that it would no longer fund Operation Grange past March 2020. Madeleine McCann had now been missing for 12 years and 10 months. The most expensive, high-profile, and politically backed investigation in modern British history had, like all the others, withered on the vine. It had found nothing. Operation Grange, the great British hope, was withering on the vine. The investigation, once a massive undertaking of Scotland Yard, had been scaled back to just 4 investigators. The British government had announced that it would no longer fund the search past March of 2020. After so many years, so many false leads, and so many millions of pounds spent, the case was about to be shelved for good. Then, just as the last of the funding was set to expire, a fresh breath of life came from an unexpected quarter. In June of 2020, a German prosecutor held a press conference. He announced he had concrete evidence. He had a name. He had the man who, he was sure, had kidnapped and murdered Madeleine McCann. His name was Christian Bruckner. The profile was a chilling fit. At the time of Madeleine's disappearance, Bruckner, then 30 years old, had been living in Praia da Luz. He was a drifter, living in a Volkswagen Westphalia camper van. His physical description, blonde hair and a pockmarked face, was a near-perfect match for the description given by the 12-year-old Tamsin Silence, the witness who had seen an ugly and disgusting man staring at apartment 5A 2 days before the disappearance. Bruckner's rap sheet was a long, dark history of crime. It included 17 burglaries, drug trafficking, and several incidents involving crimes against young girls. He was already suspected in several other child disappearances and sex crimes in Portugal. Committed between the years 2000 and 2017, when the German prosecutor made his announcement, Bruckner was already in prison. He was serving a 7-year sentence for the assault of a 72-year-old American woman in the Algarve, a brutal attack that had occurred in 2005. The British government deemed this new lead sufficient to keep Operation Grange going just a little while longer. The concrete evidence, the prosecutor claimed, centered on a mobile phone. German police had discovered that Bruckner's phone had received a 30-minute call near the Ocean Club on the day of the disappearance, May the 3rd, 2007. The call had taken place in the daytime, several hours before Madeleine vanished. A witness, a British woman who Bruckner was dating at the time, also came forward. She claimed that the night before, on May the 2nd, he had allegedly said to her, "I have a job to do in Praia da Luz tomorrow. It's a horrible job, but it's something I have to do, and it will change my life." The German prosecutor's theory was that Bruckner had originally intended to burglarize apartment 5A, but upon discovering the children were left to sleep in the room alone, his intentions had turned predatory. But like all leads in this case, this one began to fray under scrutiny. Bruckner, for his part, had an alibi. He claimed to have been miles away with a young German woman and her parents on the night of the disappearance. He claimed he drove them to the airport in Faro on May the 4th, and that they had all been stopped and photographed at a police roadblock. The investigation stalled. In July of 2020, German police excavated an allotment in Hanover associated with Bruckner. They found nothing. A year later, in October 2021, the German prosecutor told the media that he had no DNA evidence, but that he was 100% sure Bruckner had abducted and killed Madeleine. He refused, however, to show this concrete evidence to Gerry and Kate McCann, arguing, strangely, that it would take away all hope that Madeleine was alive. The prosecutor boasted that he would probably charge Bruckner in 2022. He did not. The cited cause of the delay was a jurisdictional issue, over which German court would be responsible for the trial. But as time stretched on, it did not explain why, by December 2024, Bruckner had still not been charged for the abduction of Madeleine McCann. In April of 2022, the Polícia Judiciária in Portugal, in a move seen as a formality, declared Christian Bruckner an arguido, making it possible to extradite him for questioning. They did not. In the autumn of 2024, Bruckner was put on trial in Germany for 5 other offenses committed in Portugal between 2000 and 2017. On October the 8th, 2024, despite witness testimony, he was acquitted of all charges. It did not bode well. It suggested that the concrete evidence in the McCann case might not be concrete at all. It might simply be another instance of prosecutorial grandstanding, an official associating himself with a famous case. On May the 3rd, 2023, Kate and Gerry McCann, their now 18-year-old daughter Amelie, and a crowd of 70 well-wishers and supporters gathered in the village of Rothley. They were there to mark the 16th anniversary of Madeleine McCann's disappearance. Madeleine's brother, Sean, was not able to attend. The crowd lit candles and said informal prayers, repeating the phrases, "Never give up," and "Still missing, still missed." Kate and Gerry did not address the crowd directly. But Amelie, who was only a toddler in May 2007 and who was now about to enter university, told the people gathered, "It's nice that everyone is here, but it's a sad occasion." At the time of writing, in December 2024, Madeleine McCann would be 21 years old. Jim Gamble, the former head of the Child Exploitation and Online Prosecution Command, once told a story about a poem that had drifted into his mind, one that seemed to capture the terrible, lingering nature of the case that had walked with the McCanns and the world for so long. "I walked a mile with pleasure," she chattered all the way, "but left me none the wiser for all she had to say. I walked a mile with sorrow, and ne'er a word said she, but oh, the things I learned from her when sorrow walked with me.